Now, the final thing you should know before you start creating your geofilter is the Snapchat Geofilter Submission Guidelines. Now, these are the guidelines you should follow when designing your geofilter to make sure that it's what Snapchat is looking for and that it gets accepted. So I'm going to jump onto the computer again and then break down the guidelines for you depending on whether you're creating a community geofilter or an on-demand geofilter. Now, there are a few differences between the guidelines of a community geofilter and an on-demand geofilter, but first let's cover the general requirements for all geofilters. The first is that the graphics need to be 100% original. Also, logos and branding aren't allowed in community geofilters or personal on-demand geofilters. Also, your geofilter cannot include photographs or designs that are extremely photorealistic, and you are also not allowed to use hashtags in your design. Another guideline to follow is to make your geofilter design visually compelling and something that is relevant to the area and useful to the users. Now, some of the technical requirements are that the geofilter design be 1080 pixels wide by 1920 pixels tall. It also needs to be a PNG image file, preferably a PNG 24. And this PNG file also needs to have a transparent background so the snaps can show through the design. The geofilter should also be under 300 kilobytes in file size. And your geofilter design shouldn't cover up too much of the screen. 25% coverage of the screen is a good ballpark number to shoot for. When selecting a location for your geofilter, here are a few guidelines to keep in mind. First is to select a place where people will gather and take snaps. Also, if you're submitting a community geofilter, try to keep the geofence to cities and towns or local areas rather than larger areas like states, regions, and provinces. Also, keep in mind that businesses are not eligible for community geofilters, so do not include any logos or branding for businesses in your community geofilter. And finally, when submitting a community geofilter, provide a good description to explain why the geofilter is important to you and important to the people in that area. Now, there are some guidelines that are specific to on-demand geofilters. However, most of the general requirements still apply, so keep those in mind. First off, if you're submitting a business on-demand geofilter, only use logos that you own or have the permission to use. Also, if you're submitting a business on-demand geofilter, you'll be asked to include your business name along with your submission. It will then be displayed on top of your geofilter for a few seconds when a user swipes onto your geofilter in order to let them know that it is a sponsored geofilter, and then the text will disappear soon after. Also, you're not allowed to use phone numbers, emails, URLs, snap codes, or usernames in your on-demand geofilters. Again, hashtags aren't allowed. Lotteries aren't allowed. No more than 2 lines of non-stylized text. In other words, keep it graphical and keep the words to a minimum. And finally, drug-related content is not allowed. However, references to alcohol are approved on a case-by-case basis. And that's a rundown of the geofilter submission guidelines as of this recording. However, these geofilter guidelines have the possibility of changing in the future, so it's important to review these geofilter guidelines directly from Snapchat's website to make sure you're following the current ones. In order to help you review the current Snapchat geofilter guidelines, I will have a link to Snapchat's page below. Now, in the next module, we're going to cover how to plan for your geofilter, and in the next lesson, we're going to cover how to pick the right location for your community geofilter.